Rockefeller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I pray that out of these public hearings is going to come, yes, some more public understanding of what is and is not happening in the world of intelligence. But more importantly, I hope that because we are public, that the intelligence community is listening very closely. Because there have been some things uncovered here which have not been a part of the public domain. And the whole question of the 85% controlled by the Secretary of Defense and 15% by the Central Intelligence Agency Director is not known. There are huge problems lie in that. What I fear and what I hope our chairman and our membership will not allow to happen is that this becomes another study without a report. We have very good reports, but no, there may be no action. I share your frustration. Mr. Hamlin, I want to start with a towards us question for you. When you're talking about reform in intelligence, you're also talking about decent, good oversight. And we do that, but we do it on a very short timeline because unlike any other committee in the United States Congress, in the House and the Senate, we are constrained by the number of years that we can be on this committee. I know a lot about health care. It took me 12 years to learn it. This is much, 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 much more complicated. After 8 years, I'm off. Chairman Graham is superb chairman, has to leave because the majority leaders have a rule, majority have a rule that you can only do 8 years and then you're off. So you can't build up the expertise. I mean refined expertise. You can develop knowledge, but you can't get the refined expertise that you need, the nuances, the countries that you've been to, digesting, ingesting, thinking through, rejecting bad concepts that appeared to you when you first encountered them, and then you discovered they weren't as good because of other things. It's mature learning. The reason they have that, I think, is because of power. So many people want on these committees. I don't know. I have no basis for saying that, but that's my judgment. And I think it's really damaging to good oversight because I think it encourages gotcha. It encourages when people don't have adequate information or they don't have refined, matured, you know, like good wine information. What they do is they retreat to attack. Because it's always easier to find something wrong with the other people than it is to figure out what should we do. Eleanor Hill lists all these commissions. You say for 35 years you've been waiting. Well, there's a reason for that, I think. And part of the reason is that we are limited in our oversight and therefore not sufficiently confident in our oversight and don't have sufficient time for our oversight. And because of this, what I call ridiculous 8-year rule, I would like your judgment as a former chairman on that matter.
Well, I think you've stated it better than I can. I would remove the limits. I think it's 6 years in the House.
I think it's now 8.
8 years. 8 years. I'm out of date. So it's 8 years. When the Intelligence Committee was originally put together in the House, the idea was to put on it very, very senior members who were inside players, who would not speak to the press. Chairman Boland was chairman of the Intelligence Committee for a long time in the House. I don't recall exactly, but I don't think I ever recall an interview he gave to the press. And you did not want to have a big turnover. But because of the pressures, you said it's the most popular committee. Congresswoman Pelosi is here. She's part of the leadership. I know she would say, or at least I think she would say, that it's probably the most popular committee in the House, or among the most popular committees. So there's enormous pressure to get on the committee, and the 6-year limit becomes a political judgment, in a sense. From the standpoint of effective oversight, I agree with your comments. You'd be better off to have people who get intimately acquainted with a very complex subject matter. I think I was on the Intelligence Committee at least 2 years and maybe 3 before I understood the terminology. The field that General Odom worked in is enormously technical. And a fellow who comes out of Indiana and didn't know anything about those things had a hard time. So I'd take the limits off. I know that creates problems for the leadership, but in terms of effective oversight, it's the best thing to do.
I thank you. I won't ask others for their opinion. If we invade Iraq, it would not be impossible that there would be retaliation. And if that's the case, and retaliation in the homeland, then that brings up the question of how ready are we? And what about all those sleeper cells? And what about the ones that will exponentially grow because of what will then follow? And who knows what follows upon what follows? That brings up the question, which I think was discussed to some degree while I was coming back. And that is, if you've got this, Judge Webster, you say this refined sensibility about let's keep America the way America is, and I agree with that. But you have a situation where right now you have about, I think it's 11 FBI people working in counterterrorism at the FBI, at the CIA, and about 25, including 19 analysts from the CIA working at the FBI. It's not what I would call sort of covering the country. Now, nobody wants to put the CIA intelligence in terms of the intelligence gathering in this country. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's the deal. It'd be very hard to do around here. So we talk about, well, we've got to get some alternative organization, some alternative way of doing it, or we get a cabinet secretary, or we get somebody who's in charge of the whole thing. But in practical terms, as you said, Judge Webster, this whole deal has so changed, and we are, this next 20 or 30 years is going to be so dangerous that we have to think in very, very different terms. And just as you know, people don't like being strip searched when they go through the airports, but they get onto an airplane and they're safe, they adjust. If they want to travel, they do what's necessary. As you said, there's not enough security until you need it, then you can't get too much. So to each of you, I would like to ask the question which may have been asked before, what do we do about that? I mean, and I'm going to predicate that with the Inspector General of the FBI came out recently, and he said that with regard to the FBI, the Department of Justice Inspector General released this, that in spite of 9/11, as well as a commitment made 3 years prior to that, I'm looking at the FBI now, the FBI has yet to perform a comprehensive written assessment of the risk of the terrorist threat facing the United States. That's right here. Number two, according to that same report, the FBI has not established a core training curriculum. And this is your point, General. The two different people, two different cultures, one is not the other. But you'd think that if they'd be doing this sort of core curriculum training, if there was a chance of turning an FBI agent into an intelligence gathering operator, that there would be training. There's no proficiency standards for incoming agencies working on counterterrorism, nor does the FBI measure the proficiency of agents working counterterrorism squads in the field or in headquarters units. And he says that the type and extent of counterterrorism-related training varies throughout the FBI in a way which is not helpful. This despite testimony that the committee received last week that the FBI in 1998 established counterterrorism as Tier 1 priority. Now, I just ask you, waiting 35 years, 9/11, we're either going to go to war, we're not going to go to war, but somebody has got to figure out where the bad folks are at home. And I want answers from each of you as to how that ought to be done in your judgment, without being too careful about what you say. I want answers that are helpful to this committee. Maybe they're answers that can't get passed in legislation. Then so be it. But what should happen? General.
I would repeat what I mentioned earlier. I think the counterintelligence function, and it would be both domestic and foreign counterintelligence, that is, on focusing on gathering intelligence on intelligence, and I think it will overlap into terrorism very heavily, should be pulled out of the FBI and should create a new counterintelligence service. Now, you made the point earlier that we're going to have something happen here. Who's going to watch for all these sleeper cells? Analysts can't do much about watching for sleeper cells. It's going to take a lot of people who are field agents looking at them, people who will commit themselves to the surveillance time, to the activities that are required to run these kinds of operations. The weakness of U.S. counterintelligence across the board, the military services and elsewhere, has been inadequate resources to do this kind of thing. It's not sexy compared to the intelligence of finding an enemy tank or an airplane or what somebody's political program is in a foreign country. And it's always been less well funded. I don't know how you can, if you mix the law enforcement, you've got plenty of law enforcement people out there to arrest people. But to surveil the particular cases and to gather the intelligence, which you can then turn over to a law enforcement to bring them in, strikes me as another business. You have to separate that out. We will miss some. It's like other kinds of things, but we will increasingly become more proficient at it. I would cite the experience of how Britain has dealt with Northern Ireland. They've had a member of the royal family killed. Part of it is learning to cope psychologically with the public at large. And I think a hearing like this maybe can contribute to that. But I think we will learn how to cope. We'll become much more skillful in identifying those, but you won't unless we make this organizational change where the intelligence function here is separated from the law enforcement function.
Well, I think the threat of terrorism is going to require an unprecedented overlap between intelligence and law enforcement. And we understand that both of the primary agencies here, the FBI and the CIA, have operated for a very long period of time doing what they have done, and I would argue they've done it quite well. Now they're suddenly confronted with a new world, and the director of the FBI is told and says, our #1 priority is prevention. Now that's a huge change for the FBI. It just turns the agency around from a law enforcement agency to prevention. And we cannot expect that to turn around on a dime. It's like the ocean liner. It takes a while to turn it around. I have a lot of confidence in Director Mueller and in Director Tenet. I think they're very good people. I think they're very keenly aware of this problem, and I think they want to try to correct it. What does it require? It requires then, first of all, leadership at the top. If you don't have the leadership there, you're not going to get anywhere. I don't think it's a statutory solution, a legislative solution to the kind of problems you cited a moment ago. A couple of them surprised me a great deal. And may I say that in this role, the oversight function that you perform becomes exceedingly important to see whether or not the FBI and the CIA and other agencies perhaps are doing the kind of job you want them to do. And it requires more and more tougher oversight because they have been asked to go through such a remarkable transition in the focus of their agencies. And there are thousands of people that are involved here. So it takes leadership, it takes oversight, and it demands in that oversight process that you insist on the sharing of information that is at the heart of so many of the problems.
Chairman Hamilton,
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
The gentleman on your right made what I think is the ultimate statement: no organizational reform can overcome the absence of effective leadership and management, but dysfunctional organizational structures can neutralize the efforts of best leaders. I think that's our problem. It's dysfunctional organization. I want this to go on to you, General Webster. You say it takes time. I don't know how much time we have. We probably don't have the time for that cultural change. We had a hearing the other day. I'll put this to General Webster. When we had an FBI agent from Minneapolis, who had dealt some with the Moussaoui situation, and he had two alternatives before him. One is that Moussaoui's French visa had expired. That was a bad thing. He enforces the law, and so he went that direction. His alternative was that there was some evidence that Moussaoui might have terrorist connections. He chose to ignore that, not surveillance. That's not his job. I said, but how could you possibly pick the choice not to surveil over expiration of a French passport? Because he said, basically, that's my job. Now, how do you, in fact, change that culture? We can talk about it. We can say it happens. The chip turns slowly, but it isn't going to happen, is it?
I don't know quite how to walk into that question.
Oh, try your best, sir. You've done it all.
First of all, one of the problems that worries me about too expansive a view of prevention is that the next word you hear is disruption. And that any technique to disrupt something is the thing that you want to do, even before you've run the surveillance that you were talking about to get the greater information. So it's stop this fellow quick, whoever it is, disrupt the organization. I hope that those things I heard right after 9/11 have been digested and refined, and that we're not looking at that kind of a situation. It is one investigative tool when you have a bad guy. Al Capone went to jail on income tax evasion. But the importance is it's not a cultural problem that he didn't want to look into the terrorist thing. He believed he had something to stop the terrorists. I don't know the full facts, but I can relate to why he did it. We had the same problem in drugs, learning to let drugs run under control so you could get to the top and find out what was going on about it. Countries even, you had to arrest somebody the minute you saw a drug on the table. The FBI has developed a capability, and it needs a much stronger capability now, to work with the information coming from abroad, primarily through the Central Intelligence Agency, to mesh that information and follow up on those leads, and to be sure that that information is delivered to the right people and acted upon. We have to have that interface. I tried to say earlier, counterterrorism is not pure intelligence. It's not about finding the throw weight of a new Russian weapon or looking into economic issues that might result in some adverse circumstance around the world. It's about crime, here and now, being planned against us. And we need to have people in place who can deal with it. If the numbers are wrong, the numbers can be quickly adjusted, and should be. I don't warm to the idea of separating counterterrorism from the FBI. We're not England. We're not 500 miles across our territory. We have thousands of miles to cover. Would you propose to create an organization that had people all over the United States, as the FBI does? It does a remarkable job with its 11,000 agents, one-third the size of the police force of the city of New York, but I'd hate to think of what this new organization would have in the way of people in place, trained to anticipate, to pick up information on the spot, on the scene, in the United States, about unusual activity, to report it back and expect to have it acted upon. you wouldn't have that. And I fear you would never devote the resources to have that, a second FBI throughout the country.
All right.
So better to use what we have and train them to be more responsive, as you pointed out.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Hitz.
Senator Rockefeller, just following up on that comment. Seems that in a number of these instances, the first responder is going to be the local police. It's going to be the local person who is checking trucks that go through the Lincoln Tunnel. It's going to be the person on the checking line at an airport. And what you're going to, it seems to me, what you do to amplify the force multiplier here is going to be CIA and FBI in their responsibilities getting more proficient, but also interacting with people on the ground who are going to have the first contact.
That's right, Mr.
with a
Hitz.
potential terrorist.
And in West,
so you're not going to have a zillion
and in West Virginia, we
agents.
have a superb state police,
Yep.
which I governed for 8 years, and they have 63 detachments, and as of about 8 months ago, 7 of them had internet capacity. So now you tell me how they get this response.
Well, they obviously going to have to find some way to get some resources
and
to
so
do this.
get resources. I understand all of that. People don't come forward. They don't put their positions on the job. When I'm chairman of the Veterans Administration, and I'll stop. I'm chairman of the Veterans Administration. The first question I always ask the person who comes up before us for confirmation, the beginning of a new presidency, is, will you, if you don't get the budget that you need, will you go into the Oval Office and put your job on the line? So I'm going to get this, bypass OMB. OMB has to clear every single piece of testimony that's given before any committee in the Congress. OMB has to do it. That's Mitch Daniel running the president. Okay? So, so I ask them, are you willing to put your job on the line? And that's where we get into the 85-15 thing. Defense has 85. You know, George, who I think is terrific, has 15. He doesn't go to stray outside of his 15 because he'll get knocked down by the Secretary of Defense every single time. And so the pattern continues while we talk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.